The year is 1988. Nintendo was dominating the console market, and while other companies also had systems of their own, none could match the success of the Nintendo Entertainment System. One company who aimed to go a step further was Sega, who was slowly trailing behind with their Sega Master System. They knew that in order to stand up to Nintendo, they needed a system that could bring more power than its competition. Thus, they got to work on the Sega Genesis, or Sega Mega Drive as it's known in Japan and Europe. The allure of enjoying near-arcade accurate gameplay at home, plus the help of a certain blue hedgehog, would allow the Genesis to grow in popularity and eventually match the NES's successor, the Super Nintendo Entertainment System, in what is known as the most recognizable console rivalry of all, the 16-bit wars. Both companies gave it their all when it came to showing what their respective consoles were capable of, and players were happy that no matter which system they chose, they would always be able to enjoy an incredible selection of games. Sega was known for playing dirty during this time, with aggressive advertising campaigns, but ultimately, the system wouldn't be the fan favorite it is today if it didn't have the hardware and software to back up its bold claims. At launch in 1989 came what is collectively known as the Model 1. This console can immediately be recognized by the large Sega Genesis logo beneath the cartridge slot and the now humorous phrase, high-definition graphics. Although the hardware would be revised and consolidated over the course of the console's life, there are a few reasons why many consider the Model 1 to be the best. The front of the console features the standard power switch, reset button, and headphone jack with volume control. Yes, that's right, the Model 1 Genesis had a 3.5mm stereo headphone jack on the front with its own independent volume control. This was extremely useful for getting stereo separation in all your Genesis games, as the Model 1 was not capable of stereo from its AV output. The back of the console had connections for power, AV output, RF output, and an expansion port which was only ever used in Japan for the Mega Drive modem. Most people at launch used the RF output to connect their Genesis consoles to their TVs, but that was only because RF was what Sega included with the console. Composite video cables could be purchased separately, but notice that the red jack is missing. This comes back to the Model 1 not being able to output stereo audio from its AV jack. If you have a Genesis hooked up this way and want stereo sound, use a headphone jack to dual RCA cable to run sound from the system's headphone jack to your TV, and only use the yellow jack from the AV cable. Now you'll have crystal clear audio from your console. Just make sure to keep that headphone slider up. Speaking of audio, the Model 1 is arguably the best way to experience the many excellent Genesis soundtracks due to it including an authentic Yamaha YM2612 sound chip. As Genesis audio is notoriously hard to replicate, getting original hardware like this will greatly improve the audio quality. As for video quality, many people are perfectly happy with composite, but the Genesis does support S-Video as well, whether it be through a converter of some kind or modification. But there's really not much of a reason to do that anymore since the Genesis also supports glorious RGB. However you go about obtaining it, plug in a SCART cable and be amazed at some of the sharpest pixels you'll ever witness. This is definitely the definitive way to play Genesis games, or even Master System games, as the Model 1 contains a coprocessor identical to that of the Master System. By using a device like the Power Base Converter, Master System games can be played just fine through a Sega Genesis. No matter what game is being played, RGB will let you see things you may not have noticed before. On the underside of the console is another expansion port that was eventually used for the Sega CD, but we'll get to that another time. Finally, on the front, two controller ports are accessible, allowing both Genesis and Master System controllers to be used. The Genesis controllers, however, are almost unanimously praised. The original Genesis controller is simple in design. It has a D-pad, 3 face buttons, and a start button. Keeping in mind that the original intention of the Genesis was to feature arcade-quality games, this makes sense given that few arcade games had more than 3 buttons to worry about. The controller looks large at first, but it's surprisingly comfortable to hold, and the D-pad, although large, is incredibly responsive. Despite being a great controller, the popularity of fighting games on the system led Sega to redesign it in 1993, resulting in the 6-button arcade pad. This controller was smaller than the 3-button equivalent, but was still comfortable to hold. With an additional 3 face buttons, fighting games were much more accessible. The controller also had a mode button on top, which was used to transition between 3-button and 6-button mode. Some games, such as Ms. Pac-Man, are incompatible with 6-button controllers unless this button is held down on game startup. Sega also produced several arcade joystick controllers for the console, giving gamers plenty to choose from when playing their games. For 3 years, all Sega Genesis consoles were Model 1 units, but beginning in 1990, Sega began to implement some changes. Many people may be familiar with this message which appears every time the Genesis is powered on. This is known as the Trademark Security System, or TMSS for short. It was implemented to discourage game piracy and unauthorized games on the platform. Older Genesis consoles do not have this, and boot directly to the game as soon as the power is switched on. TMSS would continue to be present in every subsequent iteration of the Genesis, making those few older units without it somewhat valuable. In early 1992, Genesis consoles looked a little bit different. The expansion port was missing, high-definition graphics was gone, and the system's sound quality was noticeably worse. Little did consumers know that these units were the prototypes for Sega's first major revision, the Model 2. The Model 2 was bundled with Sega's biggest game of the time, Sonic the Hedgehog 2. Its appearance was a significant departure from the Model 1, with the Genesis logo being scaled down and the console taking a more square shape as opposed to the rectangular shape of the Model 1. Both the power and reset buttons were turned into just that, buttons, as opposed to the power switch of the Model 1. To retain compatibility with the Sega CD, which was also redesigned at the time, the lower expansion port was retained, but as the modem was never released outside of Japan, the first expansion port was removed. The back of the Model 2 is significantly scaled down compared to the Model 1's abundance of ports. Now, there is only a power jack and AV output. The AV output retains all types of video connections as the Model 1, so RGB cables will still work, but the sound is substantially worse for wear. The Model 2 uses a newer version of the Yamaha sound chip, and as such the audio clarity is worse. Games will sound muddier and not as clean on a Model 2, and its lack of a headphone jack means that those RCA cables will no longer work. However, the Model 2 did improve on its predecessor by offering stereo sound straight from the AV jack. Due to the console's timing, this is the most common model of Sega Genesis. Later down the line, Sega would revise the Model 2, improving its sound quality tremendously. If you're searching for one of these units with improved sound, look for a unit where the board does not extend across the entire length of the vents underneath. The Genesis was selling well, but what is a console without games? Next to its hardware, the Genesis would mainly be remembered for its quality selection of games. The system was initially known for its arcade ports at launch. Games like Altered Beast and Golden Axe were praised for looking close to the arcade versions, with only some cutbacks to the visuals and sound. However, later on Sega realized that they needed a mascot who could compete with the likes of Nintendo's Mario. Their previous effort, Alex Kidd, was not the most popular, so Sega tried again with Sonic the Hedgehog. The brainchild of Yuji Naka and Naoto Oshima, Sonic was able to showcase what the Genesis fast processor was capable of, as the gameplay was based on speed. Sonic was a huge success, cementing its status as the killer app of the Sega Genesis and receiving many more installments later on. While Sega made many first-party titles to expand the system's library, they were also relaxed when it came to allowing others to publish games. Thus, many third-party games were released for the Sega Genesis, whether they were Japanese-made like Contra Hard Corps or Battlemania 2, or American-made like Earthworm Jim and Battletoads Double Dragon. One of Nintendo's weaknesses at the time was their censorship policies, but Sega was more forgiving of games with violent content, such as their inclusion of blood in the Genesis version of Mortal Kombat. Many games released on the Genesis made good use of the system's hardware, but one area where some felt certain games fell flat was the music. The Yamaha YM2612 was difficult to program for, so a couple games ended up having poor soundtracks. However, when utilized properly, the Genesis was capable of amazing music. Sega Genesis and Super Nintendo fought for supremacy from 1991 to 1995, and during that time, Sega were busy working on their next console, the Sega Saturn. In the interim, Sega attempted to extend the life of the Genesis with 2 expansions, the Sega CD and 32X. Neither did spectacularly well, with the 32X especially failing, but those are consoles for another time. After the Saturn was released in 1995, the Genesis surprisingly still had some life left in it, as evidenced by games such as Vector Man, which pushed the system to its limits graphically with impressive lighting and pre-rendered sprites. For about 2 years, the Saturn and Genesis coexisted on store shelves, with Sega supporting both consoles. Games like Sonic 3D Blast would see both a Saturn and Genesis version. Later that same year, Sega modified an existing product of theirs, the Mega Jet, into a new product for North American gamers. The Mega Jet was a consolidated Mega Drive for use on Japanese airlines. Sega of America added a screen to the Mega Jet and renamed it the Nomad. As far as hardware goes, the Nomad is similar to the Model 2 Genesis, but has some improvements such as a stereo headphone jack. It could also function as a standalone Genesis, as it used the same AV out plug as the Model 2, and even featured a second controller port on the bottom. The screen was okay for 1995, but nowadays it is extremely blurry. Reading text on this screen is almost impossible, and moving images appeared to blur together. Fortunately, many have modified their Nomads with modern LCD displays. The Nomad was also infamous for its battery life, which drained 6 AA batteries in about 2 hours. Despite being a solid iteration of Genesis hardware, the Nomad sold poorly, and is rather expensive to obtain these days. In 1997, Sega sold the rights to manufacture Genesis hardware to Majesco Sales, a company that specialized in repackaging and reselling video games. The result was the Model 3 Sega Genesis. Minuscule in size and sold at only $50, the Genesis 3 was intended as a budget entry into the world of video games. Most of the features of the previous Genesis consoles were removed, including an LED power light, a few internal components, and compatibility with the Sega CD and 32X, though 32X compatibility can be restored with a complex mod. However, the console still supports RGB, and some of the units even support stereo sound. Considering its drawbacks though, the Genesis 3 is a console that is meant more for collectors these days. In addition to this new revision, Majesco also re-released a number of existing games using parts acquired from Acclaim. They also developed and released Frogger in 1998, making it the last official game for the Sega Genesis. In 1999, Sega discontinued all Genesis game and console production to focus on their new console, the Dreamcast. Despite Sega's questionable tactics during the mid-90s, the Genesis enjoyed a long lifespan and managed to coexist with the Saturn on store shelves. After achieving retro status, the Genesis obtained a solid fan base that continues to this day. The homebrew scene is alive and well, with new games being developed every year. Many of the system's defining games have been re-released in some form. Some games are digitally available on their own or in small packs like the Sega Vintage Collection series, while a number of physical compilations like Sonic Mega Collection also exist. Some consoles, such as the AtGames classic Genesis systems, have attempted to recapture the experience of playing on an original Genesis, but these systems suffer from poor emulation and terrible sound replication. Sega have since cut ties with AtGames and are in the process of their own miniature console, the Mega Drive Mini. Whether or not this console is an improvement remains to be seen, but the Genesis gains more of a following as the years pass and has secured its position as the one console that truly stood up to Nintendo.